Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the classic FPS Retrospective, Part 1. Because presumably we're going to be doing multiple parts after we play some more stuff. Joining me as always is Dynamo. What's up, dude?
Hello there.
All right, so I have myself a brand new microphone that's finally hooked up, which is great because we're going to be talking a lot in this particular video. So hope you're strapped in. It's going to be kind of like the Red Alert reviews or the older custom campaign reviews you may remember that Dynamo joined me on, where we're just talking, except we're not going to be reviewing as much as we are just looking back at the FPS games that we played recently, which is Wolfenstein 3D, Doom 1 and 2, Duke Nukem 3D, and Quake 1. And after we cover all of those games as far as much as we would have liked to, then we will move on to some of those other games later on. But obviously that'll be for another video. So, I mean, we were talking a little bit before we started about how exactly we wanted to start. And I figured one of the things that bears repeating, although it'll be pretty obvious if you ever go back and watch any of those videos, those playthroughs, is the fact that this was my first time ever experiencing any of these games. And meanwhile, Dynamo over here is a veteran, a wearied, grizzled veteran of the scene. He's played them all. He's played custom content for them all. He knows quite a bit about all of those games. And admittedly, you seemed less familiar with some of the Quake stuff than you were with some of the other stuff. But for the most part, like, you knew what to expect, generally speaking, and you had some sort of information for me that gave me some sort of presupposition or some idea of what to expect going into it. So, I figured we should just get that out of the way, that this, even though this is a retrospective for very old games, I have never played them before, so they're very new to me in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously we haven't played all of them. We started with Wolfenstein 3D, which is considered to be the grandfather of the genre, but even that isn't technically the first one. There were some other games prior to that, but they were way more simple in terms of mechanics. They mostly had, a first-person perspective, and that was pretty much the selling ticket, so to speak. Whereas Wolfenstein was actually the first game that attempted to add complexity to it, so it had different enemy types and different weapons. Whereas I'm pretty sure all the other games have only one weapon available. And in fact, I'm pretty sure it was the first game that actually featured a weapon on screen. In that the FPS games before that didn't even have the graphic of your weapon, for example, as they were way more basic in how they were built. I guess I can post a screenshot to you just so you can get an idea of what we're talking about. Just give me 1 sec. So basically, stuff like this, for example, this is an earlier game by ID Software, and you can definitely see that it's definitely way more primitive in every way. But so Wolfenstein is pretty much the first one we played, and we played Doom, Doom 2, Duke Nukem 3D, and then Quake. And we played a bunch of the additional episodes for them, but we didn't play all the expansions because there's a lot of stuff that was released back then. Like, for example, Duke Nukem 3D has technically 6 episodes, but the other 2 were released later. Like, one of them was exclusive to the console version before being ported to PC, and the other one was released fairly recently, actually. Even Doom 2 had a recent episode release, but they were basically separate. I don't want to say mods since they're official content, but basically that's the idea. So we just stuck to what was available at the time, essentially. What you would buy on the store itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I figured it made more sense to stick with the official content. For one, it's what most people had played back in the day, which is kind of what I was going for as far as trying to understand the perspective of the consumer who is playing it. It's very hard to do that, but trying to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else who is playing this kind of thing for the first time, that's sort of what I was getting at with the playthroughs. And one of the reasons why I wanted to record it at all in the first place and run the games at all in the first place is because, for one, I'm interested to see exactly how these games started out and how the genre of FPS games kind of started out. We didn't go as far back as to like the hipster version of the OGs, but we went pretty much to the back end of the significant titles, which is starting with Wolfenstein 3D, as far as I'm concerned anyway, and as far as most people have told me. So yeah, that was more or less my motivation anyway going into it. I was looking at it as a newcomer, never played any of these games before, had sort of seen some Doom stuff. Like it's a shocking amount of non-exposure that I had to these games when you think about how ubiquitous they are. Like I didn't really know any of the music or the even like I couldn't necessarily even tell you what Doom guy looked like if in the UI. If you showed me like a screenshot of each game, I probably wouldn't have been able to pick it out. So coming into this stuff, very blind, basically missing out on a cultural touchstone that a lot of people had already experienced, was quite the experience myself. And I think looking at it now, it's one of those things that, again, looking back at it as we are meant to be doing in this particular video, I think these games did offer a lot more true to form, like just core gameplay. It was a gameplay experience. And that was what set it apart for me, because going into this, it should be mentioned, before I played these FPS games for the first time, I had played Deus Ex and Half-Life 2 and Black Mesa. And, these games are more about stories and narratives and movies and making you a cameraman and making you do fetch quests, and not that much about you actually playing a game or playing a game that involves shooting people anyway. So there's much less gameplay and much more other shit surrounding it in those titles compared to this, which was pure gameplay and then maybe some text that you would read in Necron's voice or something. So that was pretty much it. And I was content with that. I thought that was a nice foundation to start with. And the fact that it was 2D and that stuff didn't bother me at all, because even though there were certain situations where you're seeing like cardboard cutout enemies or something, which I think you said was due to the source ports we were using for Doom 1 and 2 or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, in the original game you cannot really do that, and even in those that you can look up and down originally, like Nukem 3D, the sprites basically filled since they use the software rendering, so they don't really look like cardboard cutouts. They still look weird, but it's a different effect entirely, essentially.
Yeah. So what I was getting at there is just that those weird edge cases that happen often enough to be noticeable, but not, they weren't so bad or so disconcerting or confusing that they took me out of the experience, because the experience was just looking for people to shoot and then shooting them. And the immersion came from the sense that you were constantly being pushed to execute gameplay functions. It's very similar to the immersion that you get out of playing multiplayer in a shooter or an RTS or something else that's a highly competitive game, where your intention is just to stay focused and win based on your own skill and based on expressing that skill and executing on strategies and all this other stuff. And you don't really get that out of most games, especially in a single player context now, because of the fact that so much of it is about essentially watered down by story. And, of course, I think it was a Romero quote or a Carmack quote, or somebody has that immortal quote where they say, story in a video game is like story in a porno. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important. That kind of essence to the idea of storytelling in a video game, that's a better starting point than saying that you're going to try to really make a deep story in a video game. Because while I think that stories can be told in video games, they have to be told through the video game play and the audio visuals, but most importantly, the interaction. And we've banged on about that in several other media, but in this particular case, I felt like you didn't have to go too heavily on the story to have something that was satisfactory and immersive. And the immersion that I got out of this game, even though I was streaming it, even though I was talking to another man while doing it, even though I was trying to shape up my thoughts and get them communicated in a way that made sense for a front-facing audience, I was still able to stay immersed enough in the game because of the fact that I was constantly expected to play the game, and that I knew that the only time I would be stopping gameplay would be when there was a victory or a defeat, or I was reloading a save or something, like basically ending game states for a short amount of time. And that is really like the quintessence or whatever, the actual essence of video games to me is not stopping until you need to take a pause to go to the bathroom or something, or until you win or lose. And that's like the main point that I wanted to get across anyway at the top of this is, before we dive into specifics about each individual game, and before we talk about like game mechanics and what we liked and didn't like, the core essence of this experience that I've had playing these classic FPS games has been that we finally have had an experience outside of StarCraft multiplayer, basically, and Counter-Strike multiplayer, some of the other multiplayer games. Again, we finally had a single player experience that made me immersed insofar as I knew I was going to be playing from start to stop until I beat the level, from the time that I started level until the time that I ended it. And that almost never happens in single player content. I mean, I actually can't think of another example where that happens in single player content other than the games that I played out of this bunch of 5 that we talked about and that we're talking about now. So I don't know what you think of that. Obviously, you've played a lot of games both since and before and since. So that's really just my first opening thought so far.
Yeah, I definitely agree entirely with this. And I think the Half-Life comparison here is pretty much unavoidable, in that Half-Life was really the first game that completely changed the way this was done, in that it didn't really have much in common with these old FPS games, even though it took many ideas from them. Like, many of the gameplay concepts that Half-Life has are actually found in some of these games. For example, the vents, which were found in Duke Nukem originally, and the laser traps, which are also in Duke Nukem, and then some other stuff that was in Quake or whatever. Some other stuff that was in Marathon, which we haven't played. But it actually inserted those concepts in a game that doesn't really play the same way at all. In that you're mostly, like you said, you're mostly a cameraman. You're mostly experiencing... it's basically like experiencing some sort of movie, some sort of, not even a movie, some sort of like university project or something, like where people experiment with different tricks, and you're supposed to be surprised by them. But once you play them the second time, it pretty much plays the same way every time after that, basically, because there's not really any diversity. There's not really any variety, basically. There's no way you can really have the same experience in Half-Life, with the possible exception of some sections with the Marines, which use different weapons. They use the machine gun and grenades, and they have a little bit more room to maneuver. So maybe those can offer a different experience every time, even if only slightly, whereas most of the time you're just going through very linear corridors. I recently watched the Mask Half-Life video, for example, just so I could also bring myself up to speed with what Half-Life is like as well. And like even in the first level of Doom, or even the first level of Wolfenstein, you have multiple directions you can go to, and depending on the supplies you get, depending on the enemies you find, depending on where you find them, as the enemies can actually usually go around the entire level, you get a way different experience every time. So it's a completely different genre, almost, I would say. And I was never a fan of Half-Life, as I made it clear plenty of times in previous videos, etc. And to be honest, I never really considered initially the modern FPS genre, at least from a single-player standpoint. Obviously, multiplayer is another beast entirely. I never considered this style of game to have any value until I played some later games that were a little bit better, like No One Lives Forever, for example, which does offer some non-linear gameplay, even though it has its own share of issues, like forced stealth action, for example. But the aspect of non-linearity and constant gameplay is definitely one of the concepts that unite all the games that we played. I think this is definitely a description that you can apply to all four of them without distinction for the particular game mechanics that every title has. Even something as basic as Wolfenstein 3D, which has, it doesn't have any verticality going on. It doesn't even have the textures, ceilings, and floors. But even that has many multiple directions you can go through. There is definitely many different routes you can take to access different areas. And so I think basically that laid the foundation that was followed very closely by all the subsequent games. And I think Half-Life is important for the video game industry's history, basically, because it didn't really take that foundation. It's not like it took that foundation and changed it in a way that didn't resemble the original anymore. It basically started fresh in that regard. It doesn't even resemble Wolfenstein 3D now it's laid out at all. And so that is why the genre is basically either dead or simply completely separate, in that every game after that, with very few exceptions, started copying Half-Life wholesale.
Yeah, I mean, even the sequels or modern takes on the Doom franchise, for example, are very much similar to that, right? They fall prey to the same sort of modernization. Like, obviously, Doom 3 is infamous for this. And then Doom 2016 and now Doom Eternal seem to be, people are slowly seeming to turn on Doom Eternal, actually. But as far as I understand, most people have positively received Doom 2016, but probably only on the grounds that it is a hollow reflection of a better time in a time where there are no similar games out there. I guess I've heard similar kind of things about Titanfall. That Titanfall, maybe the first game specifically, I'm not sure about the rest, actually has some non-linear gameplay and enough movement speed and tools for the player such that they can experience
the first Titanfall is only multiplayer, but I could be wrong.
Oh, maybe it was the second game then. Whichever one came out around 2016, because that was like a game that shared the limelight with Doom 2016. So that might be the case that it's the second one instead. But either way, I've been told that those are two games or two examples of modern FPS games that don't completely follow suit in this very narrative-driven, very linear, very static approach. Ultimately, single-player content is almost certainly going to be linear, even though there's going to be some elements that are dynamic and some elements that are static. Like you're always going to pick up a gun in this area because it was pre-placed there by the editor, but you might not always find an enemy next to the gun because the enemy has behavior according to its AI that will make it move across the level in certain areas that may change depending on what happens, like you were talking about earlier. So those are very succinct and basic examples of how you could have a static element and a dynamic element within the same linear, single player content, because, at some point there's a limit to how many different things that the programming can do. Whereas another human on the other side is obviously going to be completely different. So with that distinction aside, I think we might as well just start talking about the first big thing that I think we should talk about anyway, as far as mechanics go, is actually AI, because there was a unifying factor in these games' AI because of the fact that presumably they shared very similar engines or whatever, and also because the construction of the levels facilitated very similar AI approaches as far as the enemies are concerned. I'm sure there's very many, distinctions or whatever under the hood. But coming at it as a layman, as somebody who just played through all the games once, the AI didn't feel significantly different across all the games. Like it certainly felt worse at pathfinding in certain cases, like in Duke Nukem 3D and in Quake, particularly Duke Nukem 3D. Quake at least improved it a little bit. And considering Quake is actually a fully 3D game and not the 2.5D or simulated 3D or whatever is going on in some of the other games, you at the very least did look at that and say, oh, I actually have enemies that can navigate Z somewhat in Quake, which was a big shock, actually. That has not been replicated since, apparently. There's still enemies that can't navigate Z in modern FPS games. So big ups to the developers of Quake for doing that. But the AI in general was fairly aggressive and always ended up behaving very similarly, like in a sense that is kind of binary, I guess. A lot of the times you'll see crazy AI descriptions for things like the squad mechanics in Half-Life 2, which was an interesting experiment, but really just an experiment. And I wouldn't say that it was a very polished experiment either, because most of Half-Life ends up being kind of an experiment. Like the latest Half-Life game is an experiment with VR. And so when you're looking at the squad mechanics of Half-Life 2, that's a situation where the AI is behaving very differently under certain circumstances. In all of these games, the AI almost always behave the same exact way in any circumstance. The one caveat there is like maybe some enemies would attack you in melee differently than they would attack you if they were at a range, or they would behave something different in if they had multiple weapons or something. But in almost every modern game, when there's an enemy, there's like 6 different things that it can do. There's a whole decision tree. They're going to throw a bunch of buzzwords around you, talking about all the different things that may or may not be happening. And that's the kind of style that you'll see out of the experience of playing against modern AI in that sense, if you can even call it AI. Because usually, even if it is very sophisticated under the hood and very expensive computationally, it doesn't result in a challenge. It doesn't really result in engagement. And it's not really designed to do that either. So what I'm getting at here is that in these games, it was very basic. It was very simple, probably because of limitations that they could not really get around. And maybe there's some things that, like the Arch Vial, I guess, was kind of different in terms of it had 2 different things it could do. It could revive and it could attack. Like that's an example of them veering off the beaten path in Doom 2 and trying to do something different. So obviously it's not a one-size-fits-all rule, but by and large, the AI in this game had one objective, and it was to kill you. And that was super refreshing, and one of those things that reinforced what I was talking about earlier, where you're constantly immersed in the sense that you're constantly under attack, or you're constantly like beset upon by enemies, and you've got to figure out how to stop them in that sense. And so that's one of the things that I thought was really cool about this game. I thought this game did a really good job at, trying to force the player's hand, basically demanding engagement, demanding interaction, otherwise the player would die. Most games don't do that anymore, and that's one of the things that really set this apart. And I think a big part of that is the AI, as flawed as it may have been in some niche cases, or in some cases where the pathfinding wasn't all that it was, chalked up to be. So do you have anything to say about the AI specifically in these games?
Well, yeah, like you said, it's definitely a very basic AI, but it still works better than many games that came out after it. Again, to bring up Half-Life again, since I've watched Mesk's video recently, like I said, I don't know if you have, but in that video, you can actually see that AI sometimes shuts down entirely. You literally see some of those aliens wandering around, then all of a sudden they just stop. You can literally smack them in the head with a crowbar and they will do nothing at all. They will not respond to you. And this is actually a problem that exists in games to this day. So, like you said, they try to make the AI seem more sophisticated than it really is. But I think that's just in order to, like, maybe their philosophy is that they introduce new enemies and they have to justify their introduction by just making it gimmicky in some weird way instead of just trying to improve the AI and make the enemies different due to their actual weapons that they use or their behavior in general, instead of just having them respond differently to the environment in ways that are not actually functional. And I think speaking again of the enemies and the AI, another thing that I quite like about this is that with very few exceptions, the enemies always respond the same way to every weapon that you use. So there is no stuff like a weapon that cannot be used on a specific type of enemy. Every weapon can always be viable, and weapons are generally more or less effective depending on the type of encounter you're fighting, rather than on predefined damage values that the enemies have stacked on top of them, basically. I don't know if this is the same in the new Doom games. Like, I would imagine not, actually, from what I've heard from Doom Eternal specifically. But this is definitely one aspect that I really like about the original games. And the only exception is that some enemies, like the Cyber Demon in Doom, or the boss enemies, I think, in Duke Nukem, and the big white the Shamblers in Quake, they're actually immune to explosions. They still take damage from direct hits, but they're otherwise immune to the actual explosion, which I think was done mostly for like, they basically try to avoid some cases where the enemies would take damage from their own projectiles, but definitely chose a poor way to do so. But either way, that is the only exception I can think of throughout the entirety of all the games, which is more than you can say, like you said, for many of the subsequent titles.
Yeah.
And if you have anything to add on this particular aspect. Otherwise, I can talk about the evolution of the pathfinding in the games.
Well, that might be a useful idea. What I'm thinking of right now, before you get into it real quick, is one of the things that I would levy at these games in general is that the AI, while the AI was fairly aggressive and generally basic insofar as it had only one goal, and that goal was to kill you or otherwise damage you. The one thing that's really important about that is that it mandates, it obviously mandates some action by the player, but it also has this subtlety to it where you feel as a player that the enemy has a goal. In so many cases, you're going to run into situations where you're playing a modern game, or you're playing even like an RTS, for example. Many of the viewers are familiar with RTS productions where the AI is basically just a default Blizzard script or something, and they don't actually do anything. You feel alone on the map with just a couple of things that are there to prevent you from immediately claiming victory. And all you have to do is grind through them, basically. And so it's a waste of your time because it's not engaging you. And the essence of what gives a video game value is that engagement that you get as a player fighting against another opponent who's also engaging with you for their own sake. In this case, your goal is to defeat them and their goal is to defeat you. Now, in these FPS titles, yes, you were uniquely powerful because of your arsenal and because of your health values compared to the health values of other enemies, and because of your movement speed and because of other game state basic attributes. And that was something different. That's something very different than an RTS, where ideally, like, if the players are evenly matched, then the races should also be balanced well, and then you can have an argument over who wins based on skill. You don't really get that in an FPS, but at the same time, you have the compositions designed to, compositions of enemies that is designed in some way to bring about specific behaviors from the players in order to win. And those behaviors have to be based in high skill. And this is where it becomes a very difficult puzzle to make sure that you balance at all cases. But the fact that the AI always felt like they had a goal, even if that goal was as basic as trying to kill you, meant that they were actually trying to defeat you and they were actually trying to do stuff. There are a few cases where this facade crumbles insofar as the AI may fail to path to you, or they may spin around, or they may lose aggro, or something else that feels unrealistic for the situation, feels like they should just seek you out and constantly try to harass you, or maybe retreat and have a more complex AI behavior that involves trying to summon allies to their location from elsewhere on the map, like those allies being not alerted to your presence yet, but then one of the guys attacks you or something and says, hey, there's a guy over here. something like that could add to it, and that would be a situation where it does still feel like the enemy force that you're fighting against is actively trying to beat you with all the tools at its disposal, but they aren't necessary for the bare bones immersion of I'm fighting against an enemy that actually wants to fight me back. And that's something that you almost never see in any capacity, especially in modern productions, but also, as I pointed out, in custom content and in official content for RTS games. And that's a key distinction, and one of the reasons why there is overall an overarching tone of like a pleasantry associated with playing this game, just a pleasant nature of it, insofar as it was making sure that, you still have to play the game at all points. There might be a really annoying level, like a poorly designed level. There might be just an annoying, irritating, inflated health pool or stupidly resistant enemy, as you were talking about with Shambler and Quake or some of the bosses or whatever. There's going to be certain areas where there's a hiccup, right? And that's not necessarily unavoidable. You should still criticize that where possible or where applicable. Yep. But it was the overall game was designed such that I didn't feel like it was deliberately wasting my time. It felt like those were oversights. Whereas if you're not aware enough to realize when you're wasting the player's time with any of these other methods, like an AI in an RTS that's not attacking you, or an AI in an FPS that loses aggro or shuts down, like in Half-Life, that's a situation where, like, I can't really call that an oversight as much as I can just point to you and say you're not even trying to engage me at that point. And that was one of the things that was the most refreshing aspect about this game. It goes back to the interaction that I talked about at the top of the video there. But that now, I suppose, unless you have any addendum to that, feel free to launch into the pathfinding.
Yeah, I fully agree. And when it comes to the pathfinding, Wolfenstein 3D as a grid-based pathfinding, basically. That's the best way I can sum it up. As you know, every wall in Wolfenstein 3D is composed of a single block, which is 64 by 64 in size, technically, and it always has 90-degree angles. So basically, the enemy pathfinding works in a way that they move the distance of a block every time they take a step, unless they're blocked by the player or another enemy. And in Doom, they changed that so the enemy doesn't need to move in such a restrictive way. And it's especially noticeable in games such as Cyclones, for example, which is a game that came out shortly after Doom, but still uses a Wolfenstein 3D-like engine, even though it has verticality, where the enemies still move in a grid-like way, which makes them really choppy compared to the fluid movement that Doom has by comparison.
Right.
And when it comes to Doom, exactly the main improvement was this, and also the fact that the enemies were definitely way better at navigating the levels compared to Wolfenstein, obviously. And when it comes to Duke Nukem 3D, the pathfinding has its ups and downs. They definitely try to implement stuff like enemies jumping at you, or enemies dropping down from ledges, or enemies using jetpacks. So they definitely have way more different ways that the enemies can use to navigate the levels, although sometimes it doesn't really work with some of the level design they implemented. Many of the pathfinding issues that the game has actually are down to level design in many cases. For example, we often saw that with the Doom Pinkies, they would not be able to path through certain places just because their hitbox was so large, in which case the solution is either to make the hitbox smaller, which I've actually reduced somewhat in my game set changer, or just to make the level, like just add it, for example, a bridge or whatever that they need to use so that they can actually path through it. Because you will see, for example, an imp be able to walk through it just fine, whereas the pinky is actually too big to do so, even though it doesn't look that much bigger.
Right.
Whereas for some of the bigger enemies, they actually have rooms, like the Macrobus, for example, they actually have rooms where they're able to do that more effectively. And with Duke Nukem, like the enemy jumping and some of the other behaviors that they have are actually pretty interesting. Like they even have enemies that can dodge projectiles in that game. So they definitely did improve the pathfinding in some ways, but other times, again, they placed enemies in such a way that it didn't really work very well with what they were trying to do. For example, they would place them in a very narrow spot in front of a gate, so they didn't really have enough room to go around the gate and get to you.
Right.
Whereas when it comes to Quake, they actually did add, like you said, many additions, like the fact that enemies actually have more of an emphasis on verticality than what Doom did, and they actually, can sort of calculate the distance. It's not really related to pathfinding in itself, but it's still related to AI physics. That, for example, the ogre can calculate the vertical distance, I think, and get you through their grenades that way, which sometimes is actually quite frustrating. But it does show that pathfinding is in constant evolution, and it actually improved throughout all the games in significant ways. only to get butchered again in Half-Life, you know.
Yeah,
So
of course. Always comes back to that.
Yeah, unfortunately, it indeed does. And yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. I think the most sophisticated pathfinding is in Marathon, actually, which we haven't played, but they actually have some sections where they actually go all around the bridge and they choose the very specific path that they should take in order to get to you in the most efficient way. It doesn't always work, but it was definitely the most advanced pathfinding in an FPS game at the time. It was 1994, so 1 year after Doom. But yeah, those are pretty much the main aspects of the pathfinding, I feel.
Right.
And this is something that, even though like we are comparing the games, so even though there are differences between all the games, there are still many similarities with the pathfinding. Like you said, there's many. It's actually a thing you can compare across all the games. And I feel like another thing that can be compared is actually the way the levels are laid out. So the levels are generally relatively non-linear insofar as you don't just go from point A to point B in a linear fashion. You have to figure out your way around the level. So you may choose to go in a different building in a city level before you go into another one. And obviously there are ski cars, but even those sometimes you can actually find from different locations. For example, I remember we saw one Duke Nukem 3D city level. I think it was the first level of episode 3, where there's a key underwater, and there's actually 2 completely different routes that you can take to get that key. And even then, sometimes the locked doors are actually, there's multiple of them, which means you can access a locked area from more than one section. Which is those are tenets that I'm trying to, for example, maintain in my Wolfenstein 3D map pack that I'm working on, mod/map pack, where I'm trying to make it so that you can access keys from multiple locations and also access locked areas in many cases from multiple locations, which I think adds a lot of replayability and makes the level more interesting in general. Other than that, most of the levels indeed revolved around just finding the exit, so you didn't have to do, for the most part, weird stuff like you have to shut down the generator, then wait for a cutscene to play it before you can go to the surface and drive a vehicle, for example, like you see in Half-Life 2 or in I assume Halo or some other games I haven't played.
Yeah, there's no interruptions. It's very much a straightforward, like point A to point B. Maybe there's some detours to get some power-ups or some keys or whatever. And what you said about making it so that there's some element of non-linearity as far as you can take multiple paths to the same destination or to the same objective, like a key card that will allow you to get to your ultimate destination. That is important because of the fact that it allows players to be rewarded for exploring a different pathway than another player might, or it allows them to go through there. And I think in general, when you have a situation like that, the one concern I would always have about nonlinear FPS level design is the fact that you may be confused if you're not used to that, which is not really a criticism of the actual mechanic or concept. It's more of a criticism or an indictment of default FPS games as we understand them now, where the modern single player experience is so heavily linear that when you go one route and you're like, oh, I got this key card, that reminds me there's like a blue door all the way back there. Your immediate instinct is to backtrack all the way there instead of continuing to explore to see if there's another blue door that would take you to your destination anyway. And you get there and you find out, oh, this is a pathway to where I just was. And like, that instinct has been sort of hammered into people who have played modern FPS games now, because of course they would waste your time and make you backtrack. Whereas in this case, you just found a different way accidentally by exploring. And that doesn't mean you have to go all the way back there and, again, waste your time. It just means that you've found a way into the level that they didn't expect you to find. So in that sense, like, it seems so silly to me to go about it in the modern approach when you have this example right here, all of these examples from all of these games that we played that provide you with non-linear level design that will allow you to connect from wherever you started to wherever your key card is to wherever you need to go. And in some cases, yes, the exploration was not very great, well implemented. I would specifically indict Wolfenstein 3D with this. The idea that, for one, all the levels usually looked very similar in their construction. Like, it was very rare to see a level that had a lot of dynamic design, to its visuals within the same level because of the limitations, presumably, of the engine. Yeah. And so because of that, like, it was very difficult to figure out your way through, and you had to rely on the automap, which apparently wasn't even a feature of the original game a lot.
Yeah,
it was very maze-like. Yeah, so there's a lot of reasons to indict Wolfenstein 3D specifically for something like this. But the fact that it still facilitated nonlinear level design as early as that particular game, I mean, come on, man. Like, if nothing else, that's a reflection of how far the rest of the FPS industry has fallen in that sense. The genre has fallen in general. So I'm very grateful to have experienced something like that, where I always thought that would be the best way to go, because just looking at multiplayer maps in FPS games, you want to have multiple angles of attack that lead you to roughly the same point. Not too many, but not too few, so that you can have different audibles called in the middle of strategies or in the middle of takes or whatever. You want to be able to do stuff like that. You want to free up the option, give the tools to the players to make those decisions where possible. You don't get that in single player content. So I was always abstracting that from a multiplayer context into a single player context to try to understand how that would work. Now I've got an actual example, and I can assess their execution as well as the concept. And that is so important for people who, like me, who are going to make FPS games, but also people who just want to play games and want to understand like what does work and what doesn't. And I mean, that describes pretty much everybody here. So I thought that was hugely useful for me, and just in general, an influential example of like how to do it, like one example of how you can do it that is infinitely superior, no matter how maze-like and annoying the level itself is. The concept is so much superior than the default of wasting your time by backtracking, if there is any backtracking at all, and otherwise it being a straight corridor shooter, which is more like Halo and more like Half-Life. So just unfortunate that we don't have that anymore, but so grateful that I found an example of that in these games anyway.
Yeah, and again, it doesn't just affect supplies either, because, for example, to take the first level of Duke Nukem 3D as an example, you have to go into a cinema, and there's two ways to go there. And
the very first level. I didn't even know that the second entrance existed until I died for the millionth time. And there was some ammo starvation that led to that. But like the fact that you can just do that from the start, from the very first level, there's two ways into the building that you have to go into. Like it sends a very clear signal to the player that this is kind of going to be in the game a lot. You got to be on the ball and looking for this stuff if you want to find different ways in. Basically, keep telling the player to keep their eye out. Like, hey, you can do this. This is stuff that you can do, and that will help you, deprogram yourself from the programming of the modern FPS game that has failed you.
Right. Yeah, and it also affects gameplay, because, for example, if you get through the back entrance into the cinema, you're going to find yourself into the theater room, the room where they show the movie, and you're going to see all the enemies sitting around where the chairs are. Whereas if you go through the other path, you can actually have an opportunity to go into the room where the projector is, which has a window into that room, into the large movie room, where you can actually do that. You can actually use grenades, for example, pipe bombs, to kill all the enemies that are down there. Whereas if you were to enter from the other area, it will be more difficult for you to do that, but it will be easier to use the Schengen, for example. So this is an example where different level design, like non-linear level design, allows you to better assess your equipment in a way that allows you to use basically it allows you to use different weapons depending on the circumstance that you find yourself in.
Right.
So even something as simple as entering a room from a different area can convince you to use a different weapon that you would have used if it had been a different path that you took, basically. And it sounds very sophisticated when said like this, but at the same time, it's such an incredibly simple concept. All you have to do is make two entrances. That it's, again, really surprising that it hasn't caught on for the most part. Like even in games where this happens, I've played a few, like Uncharted, for example. I don't know if you've played that. It's mostly a Gears of War style game, and it's mostly linear, but there are some sections where you can actually go through different areas, and they make the game feel so much better. They almost make you feel like the entire game should be like that, instead of the 5% of times it happens.
Right.
But unfortunately, from what I've played anyway, obviously I haven't played every game that there is, but it's very, very, very difficult to find such examples. Certainly not in a game like Dark Void, for example, where I'm pretty sure everything was linear from start to finish.
The only FPS or shooter, I guess it was a third-person shooter, the only shooter game I've played where you have a jetpack and you still can't find your own pathway. God damn it.
Yeah.
Literally can jump across 3 different levels of axes. And yes, you've got X, Y, and Z travel, but you're still going in a straight line. Which actually is funny because Duke Nukem 3D obviously includes a jetpack, and that massively morphs what you can do in that game. So I would say in some cases I don't know if the levels assume that you're going to have a jetpack, but they massively give you an advantage if you have a jetpack. And in that sense, I don't think it was, balanced around well with the level design. But still, the fact that it's there at all is pretty fucking good.
Yeah, it's definitely a nice innovation. And there were a few games before that. I think PO was another game that had a jetpack. But yeah, Duke Nukem 3D was probably the best implementation up to that point.
Certainly the best that I've seen, but obviously I haven't played much yet. So
yeah, we may come back to it eventually when we play other games that also employ it. So yeah, we covered the pathfinding, the AI, the level design a little bit. What else? What is your next? What's next on your mind, basically?
Yeah, well, AI is a big part. We had talked about that. Then we talked about pathfinding, which is sort of linked to the AI. I think we can talk a bit more about level design because we've talked about, how we handle level design as far as like pathways to your objectives. But now is maybe the time where we can actually break into specific examples and really dive deep into the idea of like what each game offered as far as level design. I already kind of prefaced this when I talked about Wolfenstein having a lot of mazes. That was very prevalent in that game. It was really just like you had some open rooms and some open areas, but a lot of mazes, especially later on, especially in Spear of Destiny. Like there weren't really a whole lot of freeform areas for you to pick from, even if you could technically have like multiple paths to a destination. You contrast that with Doom, especially like the earlier levels, I think, of the first Doom, but also in general, most of Doom 2 was pretty good. Yeah, like eventually they went into like puzzle mania with lava pits and stuff, which was really bad. And I don't think there was there any environmental damage in Wolfenstein? I don't even remember.
No, there wasn't.
Yeah, so Doom 1 was the first game to introduce that with the acid pits and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's mostly uncommon apart from like some levels in the very later game, in the very later episodes, basically, fortunately.
Right. Yeah, so that's one thing that we can talk about a little bit as a global mechanic that's in most of the games, but obviously not in Wolfenstein 3D, is these damaging floors, more or less. I feel like they morph the pathways that you end up taking in the way that they're used anyway. Like, pretty much the only time I could ever see myself using them in the construction of an FPS level would be, I think you already said that you do this, but you use it basically as like, you visualize it, but you don't actually have it as part of the gameplay environment. Like in theory, it's possible to jump into a moat filled with acid or something, but odds are you're not going to do that in the average playthrough. So even though it's theoretically possible, it's not designed as a core foundation of the map. Whereas in all of these games, like especially the later episodes of the first Doom game, you had lava all over the place, and platforming is not the game's strong suit. It's shooting and movement and being able to move around freely enough to take advantage of the movement speed and the strafing that you can accomplish in these games. And all of the times where you're breaking the pacing to avoid jumping into a pit of death is like running counterbalance straight into the face of flying in the face of the actual core mechanics of the game. And in my opinion, how the game really shines when it comes to its gameplay loop. You really didn't have that many opportunities to exploit the fact that you were moving at such a ludicrous speed compared to other FPS games. And when you get to the point where you can actually do that, in the few cases you do, it's like a taste of victory, and then you realize you're just a few levels away from falling into a lava pit next time you try to do that. So it's not even like you can really master that mechanic either, in most of the cases anyway.
Right. Yeah, as you know, I'm not a fan of that aspect at all. In my levels, I generally do not use lava pits at all. Generally, what I do if I feel like the environment needs some liquid stuff, I just have a river of some sort, like a lake, just with water. So if you fall into it, nothing happens, but it still serves a similar visual role. For example, in Doom 1, in particular in episode 3, I remember a map called Mount Erebus, which is a very wide open map, but it's surrounded by lava everywhere. So you're actually supposed to travel across different islands that are surrounded by lava. I don't know if you remember this level in particular. I might post a screenshot if you want to remind you.
Yeah, sure. I can show them on the video anyway, for the few people who have it open and want to actually look at it. So,
so basically, it was a level that looked like this, and there were basically lava pits everywhere surrounding several different islands. I don't know if this screenshot reminds you of it, but yeah. I played, just as a side note, I played a similar level to this, very similar, in fact, to the point where I feel it was a tribute to this level in a map pack that was released a long time ago for Doom. And it's very similar in concept, except there is no lava, there is water instead surrounding the entire area, so you don't take damage when you travel through it. And they managed to basically make the concept of this level way more enjoyable just with a single change. Whereas you don't have to worry about just falling into lava or just not being able to cross into another island because you don't have the radiation suit power up or you don't have enough health to do it. So you can just do that freely. You can go wherever you want, when you want. And it still looks pretty decent. It still gives you the idea of several different islands that are connected through liquids. So I just feel like, for the most part, the lava pits were not really conducive to the gameplay style. And fortunately, I think the later stages in Doom 1 were really the most annoying parts about that. I feel like in Doom 2, they were significantly scaled down. And in Duke Nukem 3D, they were also pretty rare on the whole. Whereas in Quake, lava was almost instant death in Quake, but for the most part, it was also pretty rare, fortunately.
Yeah, they scaled them back and they didn't use them as crazily as in Doom 1 and in some areas of Doom 2. So there was at least that. But I just have a distinct memory of that being such an infuriating experience going through the Doom levels. And one of the other things that is sort of related to this is the idea that, like, again, what the lava actually accomplishes. Because you're talking about replacing it with water that doesn't damage but still gives you a visual thematic. Well, if you took it the other way and you replaced all of the lava with just a wall or some other barrier, because jumping into it, you conceive of it as failure, so then you just wall it off, and so now you can't jump into it in theory. Like, imagine that setting for an example. Now you've got a level that is so much more constrained than what it initially seemed when it was lava, but like, as far as the effect of putting lava everywhere goes, that is what the level is like. Like, that's your playable area. Those are your playable map bounds. That's what you can do. That's your gameplay environment. And nobody likes those closed-in levels. Nobody wants to be limited to such a slow movement speed so that you can keep track of your momentum and not fall off into lava, just like nobody wants to not even have the opportunity to do it, which is what happened in Duke Nukem 3D. You didn't even have the opportunity to fall into pits half the time because so many of the levels, especially in, I believe, the second episode, where we got introduced into those suicidal sentry drones, in stuff like that, where the environments are so close together and so claustrophobic, you're not really given an opportunity to play the game the way that it feels is best. And that way is by moving through large rooms, kiting around enemies, and you can say that maybe that makes the encounters too easy, but then you tune up some parts of the AI. You make them more aggressive or faster or something. You don't, gimmick or gimp the player's tools. You make it so that there's tools that the enemies can use to meet that player head on and have some semblance of a fair fight.
Well, actually, I will say that the AI is stronger actually in open fields than it is in like constrained areas, except for the suicide drone. I think that is the only exception. So actually doing that is doing the opposite. So basically it makes the AI weaker than it would otherwise be if it had more room to maneuver.
Well, you have to kind of gimmick them in a closed-off environment. Like, obviously, you can gimmick them into doors with a specific example of Duke Nukem 3D's suicide drones. But in general, you can, like, corner camp. You can, like, do a lot of jiggle peeking or whatever to really bop them in the head. And you can do that without much worry or without much risk, but it still involves slowing the game down so much that I would almost never want to do that willingly. So yes, I can agree with you that it probably does make the encounters generally easier, even though I never personally would take advantage of that because I find it super boring. But yeah, the bottom line, looking at it now, is that if that's the concern or that's the motivation to make these levels so claustrophobic, then I don't think it's a valid concern, and I don't think it's legitimate argumentation. I'm not even really sure what a position would be that would justify such a thing. Like, why would you want to reduce the open playable area, the playable space? Like, you can still create cover. You can even, like, take it a step further. You're worried about, like, these areas are too open and kind of boring or whatever, kind of flat. You can elevate the Z in the level. You can make an AI behavior that temporarily erects cover or temporarily makes a block or something that it can be climbed on or something. Like, you can really go nuts. I mean, I'm sure there's some limitations now, or before, but now there's no such thing, and you can do some crazy shit like that.
Yeah,
and that can be a way better approach to having an enemy that actually does control area or have some area denial component to it. And you can worry about that, or you can, put that in, and that can be a tool for the enemies to control the player's movement in some way or funnel them down a specific decision. And then they still are being tested in terms of skill, and it's actual skill, and it's skill related to movement and skill related to everything else, like tracking enemies and kiting enemies and keeping track of all the other enemies that might be posing a threat to them later if they move a certain position. There's so much more that is at play there, that it is so much more engaging when you're actually engaging with all of the different mechanics that the game actually has to offer. And you can't do that that in these really closed off claustrophobic environments, like we saw in some of the later games or some of the later levels of the earlier games and all of Wolfenstein 3D, I would argue. So generally speaking, that's my take on the level design. I don't know if you have anything to add, generally speaking, or with specifics, specific relation to this.
There definitely were definitely at least a few levels in the second episode of Duke Nukem 3D where this happened. They did have a lot of open areas in the later levels, but I will say that maybe the second and third levels in this episode suffered from that in some areas, which maybe would not have been nearly as annoying if it wasn't for the suicide drones. Maybe those were areas that otherwise you would pass through in 5 seconds and forget about them. But unfortunately, due to the way that that enemy is designed, it was really hurting in that sense. Whereas, that definitely is an issue in Wolfenstein, especially I feel in the third episode, in the hate threat episode, unsurprisingly, for some, where they actually have way more limited areas than what they had in the later stages of the first episode. That's one thing that I found really surprising when I watched your playthrough, that I was actually surprised at how open and well-designed the later levels in the first episode were. Whereas the second episode, I think, was okay as well for the most part. Whereas the third episode really dropped the ball on the enemy placement and the really constrained locations that you fought in. Well, it's not even the fault of the engine at that point. It's clear that it's just the level design isn't as good as it used to be before. And obviously, when it comes to Quake, the issue of constrained spaces is sometimes prevalent because of 3D limitations, so they could not have as many open areas as they would have liked. So it's a little bit more corridor-oriented than Doom and Duke Nukem 3D were. But at the same time, it still does have its open areas. Like, for example, I remember in the last episode, there was like this huge temple where you could go in different floors of it, and most of it was fairly open.
Right.
And even if that may have impacted performance at launch, like it may have resulted in horrible frame rate for weaker computers at the time compared to the other levels, it was still nice to see that they still attempted to perform that. I actually, maybe it's not really related, but I recently read an article about the beta version of Duke Nukem 3D on PlayStation, which has some unique levels exclusive to the PlayStation version until they were years later ported to the PC version in a mod. The same happened to Doom, by the way. Doom had some exclusive levels on PlayStation that were later ported back. But basically, I was reading into the development files for a prototype of the PlayStation version that was found, and they basically compared the prototype levels to the final ones. And they saw that some areas were way more open than they were in the final version. And the reason for that is because of performance. So they later, in the final release, they added walls or windows that were closed off in order to prevent so much of the space from being visible to the player, which will grind the frame rate to a halt, basically. It was unfortunately a very demanding game for the PlayStation, and that's why they closed off areas that were previously open in the prototype. And I'm sure in Quake it was basically the same idea in many of the cases, where they just felt that some areas needed to be closed off in order not to be performance tracks, specifically in the demo version, which was the first episode, which I think felt the most closed off overall.
Yeah, almost certainly. I mean, in general, the level design, I want to say that it got better as it went on in that game, but unfortunately, I still remember like Azure Agony and some of the other really psychotic levels that spammed those exploding testicles at you.
Yeah,
was not
it was basically the same as the Duke Nukem 3D Suicide Drone in concept.
Yeah, except it was way harder to hit.
Yeah, it's just a really bulky enemy with a lot of health for no reason. If you want to make an enemy like that, you should not have much health. And even then, I remember a friend of mine complained about the design of such an enemy because he says that the melee combat becomes irrelevant as you cannot get close to it, whereas that's actually what you want to do when it comes to other enemies. You generally want to get close to them so you can have better accuracy when fighting them, and you also can use the Mighty Boot, for example, in Nukem 3D. You can do that for every single enemy in that game, except for the Suicide Drone and the bosses, obviously.
Right,
so that's why the enemy feels antithetical to what the game otherwise tries to do.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I mean, I'm thinking about it right now, and I'm trying to like cast my mind back to some of those other experiences, and I mean, imagining duel fights where your bosses are actually like, maybe they're bigger than you, maybe they're completely different than you in terms of like their species or whatever, maybe they have different weapons than you, but the idea of them having similar health pools or similar movement speed or some other similar attribute, I think that would be more compelling, because then you can, in theory, get close to them and Mighty Boot them if you want to, if that's your playstyle, instead of your playstyle being restricted based on the enemy type in this case. And obviously, that's something that I don't think has really ever been explored in an FPS game. At least none that I've seen. Maybe some custom content or whatever has explored dual fights in single player, but that's basically porting multiplayer context into a single player context.
Right,
so, in that sense, I can understand why people have tended to avoid it because nobody would necessarily think that it belongs together.
On the other hand, it has to be mentioned, we haven't mentioned it yet, but we probably should at this point, that these games were actually the foundation for the multiplayer scene in FPS as well. I mean, the term deathmatch was coined in Doom itself, for example. John Romero coined the term, and that Doom was pretty much the first multiplayer, or one of the very first multiplayer FPS games where they introduced many of the rules that were later used in Quake and Unreal Tournament, and later in Counter-Strike as well. So these games also have very robust multiplayer scenes, which maybe we will get around to exploring in the future sometime. But so the aspect of duel exists in the multiplayer context in these same titles that we played, but obviously not in the single player context, where you get a different type of experience when it comes to boss battles, which for the most part were not really a big focus of the titles, fortunately, because I really tend to dislike when games just turn into boss rushes with really massive enemies that take forever to kill. Like, even the bosses in this game, for example, apart from a very few circumstances, they didn't really have that much health, or otherwise they were pretty quick to kill. Like, most of the boss fights in Nukem 3D lasted about 30 seconds, if that. Yeah. And even in Doom, like the Cyber Demon in the second episode, you kill him pretty quickly. And like, even the Spider Mastermind was pretty easily dealt with. So yeah, it's not so much of a waste of time as it is in later games. For example, I'm thinking about the boss fight in Black Mesa with a giant fetus, which took forever to complete, both in the original game and in the Black Mesa. I don't know which of the two took longer, actually. But I just remember you had to spend a long time fighting that. And it just felt like you weren't even playing the game. Like, you weren't playing an FPS, you were just platforming because you were being teleported around, or you were just shooting crystals, or whatever the fuck.
Yeah, the gameplay pattern actually changed completely between those two versions, but still the result was the same, which is a very bloated boss fight that didn't really take forever because of actual elements. Like, you'll notice, I don't remember, but I'm fairly confident that at the very least the vast majority of bosses didn't have some hidden switch that made them fucking invulnerable. Like, I feel like maybe the Hitler boss fight in Wolfenstein 3D had something like that, but maybe it was just me running around looking for more ammo or something, as opposed to him actually turning invulnerable and becoming impervious to damage.
Which he wasn't.
I mean, that's so common in modern FPS games, and any game with a boss, is that at some point they switch on their invulnerability and you can't hit them anymore. And why? For no reason. Like, I've been playing some of the Borderlands games recently because they're local co-op with my brother, and obviously they're console games and they are ugly as fuck. And on top of all that, on top of the readability issues that you get from the game being what it is, the boss battles in that, or any sort of elite battle where you're fighting some sort of like quest or reward or something, like your quest is to kill some guy, there's always some element of it where they just lock you up from being able to damage them for some time, and then you're forced to shoot their ads, their men that are spawned in the middle of the boss fight. Yeah. And obviously a silly mechanic of that game is that if you get downed, you lose all your health.
That's super common, holy shit.
Yeah. When you lose all your health, you can shoot an enemy, and if you kill an enemy while you're in your downed state, you get back up and you regain some health. Otherwise, you've got to be manually revived, or if your timer runs out, then you just die, which is sort of like Gears of War being when you get downed in that game, except you can get yourself back up just by shooting people. And that is seemingly an innocuous mechanic, but it's like one of those situations where they back themselves into a wall or into a corner rather, because they have to spawn ads in the middle of this boss fight, because if you get downed by fighting this boss that has insane health pools and deals a lot of front-loaded indicator damage, then suddenly you have to shoot an ad so you can get back up if you're playing in single player, because there's nobody there to revive you. And so, like, it's one of these situations where the mechanics are straying away from just shooting somebody straightforward, because it's almost like they feel like their boss battle has to take a long time, otherwise it won't actually be considered content or sufficient content. And it's just about wasting the player's time at that point. It's not about engaging them for a longer period of time. It's about making them wait for the invulnerability to wear off. And that's just fucking boring. That's just not playing the game.
Right, yeah. Yeah, fortunately, this wasn't the case in any of the bosses in this, even if they were a minor part of the game. And I'm glad they were, because I'm not generally a fan of boss gameplay.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really comment on the boss battles in this beyond contrasting them to modern examples, but generally they were pretty dull. They were pretty forgettable. I don't feel worse for playing them, but I also don't feel enriched. And so in that sense, it's like, well, I don't even know why they put them in there. They could have done without them, but they put them in there and they weren't horrible. It's just that they weren't really that, like, they didn't really justify their own inclusion in that sense. At the same time, they didn't, make a mockery of the entire experience, but you get the idea.
Yeah, perfect. I agree entirely with that. And, well, I guess we can talk a little bit about the weapons in the games.
Yeah, I was going to move on to game state in general, weapons, enemies, then we can, I think we can probably wrap it up after that unless there's something else that springs to mind. But I did want to talk about the game states and stuff like that, including what tools you had at your disposal and some of the things that I thought were interesting about the way that the game state evolved actually across the different games, because you end up having a situation where, like, at first there were some enemies that had weapons that you didn't have access to, like in specifically the Doom games. There's like tons of enemies that that use weapons that you don't actually have access to, or because they're like endemic weapons, like the imp fireball or whatever, like these weapons that are like natural to them. But then I think in Duke Nukem 3D, most of the enemies that were attacking you, or at least a significant portion of them, when they dropped ammo, it was because they were using the same weapon, like the shotguns from the pigs and the machine guns from those weird leaping guys, lizard guys, and obviously like the pistols from the jetpack men and stuff like that.
Yeah,
like
the rocket launcher from the Tonys.
Oh yeah, as well. And I don't think they actually. Maybe they did drop.
I think they do they do rockets on occasion, from what I remember.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's right, because that was a game that had random shit associated with it, which is stupid, like random chance to drop stuff. But, when they dropped ammo, it was because they were using the gun that they were dropping ammo for. And in that sense, it was more like the similar kind of experience that you would get from multiplayer, because now you're dealing with something where it's like, I killed this guy, and he had this gun, so he's going to give me ammo for that gun, or he's going to give me that gun, and I can pick it up or something. And so, like, that's more akin to what I would want, where obviously I wouldn't necessarily restrict people to using the same gun every time, and the enemy would then instead justify their own existence based on, like, maybe it's a small nimble enemy that uses any number of guns that it can get access to, and maybe then there's some other enemies that are bulkier and heavier and have more health and are less frail, but they also can use any gun that they would have access to. I'm more inclined to believe that that's the best way to do it, because then, your weapon pool depends on what's actually around you. And then it can vary depending on the enemy, but also depending on the location and depending on what weapons are active in the map, as opposed to always being the same no matter what. But even with them always being the same no matter what, like they were in these games, you have a situation where the enemies provide you with ammo commensurate to weapons that you are familiar with. And because you've used the weapons yourself, you have some idea of what kind of damage they would deal, what their splash radius might be if it's an explosive weapon, and all that stuff. And I think if the games had maximized that more in the game states, like obviously in Quake, I felt like that almost completely fell away because a lot of enemies were melee, or they were using some weird projectile. But even the ogres obviously use grenades that you could use yourself, and you were supposed to use a lot in the areas. The humans were using weapons that you could use, but, well, I guess the shotgunners were, but the laser guns, I don't know where those came from. Stuff like that, there was some elements of it, some vestiges of it, but a lot of it was very distinct, and a lot of it was very much their own style. You contrast that to Duke Nukem 3D, and I feel like a lot of the enemies that did drop ammo did so because they were dropping ammo for weapons that you were familiar with, and as a result, you could sort of understand, like, it gave you a better appreciation or understanding of the threat level posed by different weapons and what each weapon might be most useful at, because you're using it and your opponent is using it. And that is something that I don't think really was taken advantage of in a lot of these games. That's something where I think if they maximize that, or they spent more time trying to implement that, it would be so much better, because you have some sort of built-in understanding now based on fighting them of, like, all right, this is what the strength and weakness of this particular gun is. Like, when an enemy using the shotgun shoots me from far away, I barely take any damage, or I don't get hit at all. So, like, that builds a subconscious understanding and appreciation for the weapon's strengths and weaknesses before you even necessarily pick it up for the first time, because you're fighting enemies that are using it. Then you kill one, then you go there and get it, and oh wow, now I know that the shotgun, like, based on how I defeated that guy or that group of enemies, I know, like, these guns do this based on that. And that's something that actually Halo in general, the more modern FPS game compared to these, that actually did, I would say that did it better, because some enemies did have access to different weapons, and you could use all the weapons that they dropped. And so even though it restricted the amount of arsenal that you could have at any one time, because you were limited to only having 2 weapons at any given time, which I don't agree with as a design decision, I do believe that you had built an understanding of the weapons and the arsenal and the tools at your disposal, but the grenades that people could throw, the behavior of all that. I mean, you just built this tacit understanding of all this because everything that they could use, you could also use. And that's something that I wish was maximized more in the games that we played here.
Right, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's a fair assessment. I personally, with the final levels, I almost entirely rely on pickups rather than enemies for ammo. Like even in Doom, for example, even if I have zombies, I just always make sure that you have enough ammo to deal with all enemies, even if you completely ignore the ammo you get from the zombies. But I can definitely see a different approach being taken in this case. And actually, yeah, you brought up the fact that Halo allows you to only have 2 different weapons. We actually didn't mention that at all, that you can actually take as many weapons as you want. You can take the entire arsenal in the game with you at any given time. I don't know if the Doom 2016 allows you to do that. I would imagine it does.
Yes, it does.
That's one of the foundational aspects of this game. So at least there's that. For what it's worth, even Half-Life and Doom 3 did allow you to do that. So that's a more recent degeneracy. I think it was Call of Duty who introduced it, or maybe it was some other.
Yeah, well, it was present in Halo at the very least.
Yeah,
there's a bunch of stuff like that, but yeah, I mean that's one of those.
It was
things
in Nukem Forever, actually. From
yes, it was, and that game predates all of them in terms of when its development time started, at the very least. So.
Yeah, that's a disaster.
Yeah, no kidding. But we can of course talk about the actual weapons themselves now.
I was just gonna do that. Like most of the games, obviously Wolfenstein 3D only has 3 weapons apart from the knife, which is the pistol, the machine gun, and the chain gun. Which are basically, the pistol is a single fire, like you basically have to tap it every time you want to fire, whereas the other 2 weapons are rapid fire. And from Doom, you have the shotgun, which is a bit of a slower weapon, but it packs more of a punch. So it's better used against single enemies compared to the chain gun, which is more useful against the crowds of weaker enemies. But for the most part, the games follow a similar pattern in terms of what the weapons actually do. So you have a pistol, which is a basic weapon you can use every time. Then you have a shotgun that is used, again, as a good all-around weapon for any target. And then you have a chain gun, a rocket launcher, very powerful rapid-fire weapons like the plasma rifle, then more powerful weapons like the BFG or the Devastator in Duke Nukem, or the Thunderbolt thing in Quake, for example, could be seen as being similar to plasma weapon. So the games from Doom onwards basically focus on fairly similar weapons, which I think is good because they are very archetypal. I don't know if that's the right term. Very basic, very foundational weapons, basically, that really are simple but allow you to express your playstyle in ways that may seem obvious, but actually impact the game significantly in that they actually perform better or worse against different enemies, depending on the level design, depending on the environment, depending on the composition of the enemies. Like if you're fighting, for example, a lone revenant in Doom 2, the super shotgun is probably the best weapon you can use. But if you're fighting 4 of them, then the rocket launcher is probably a better choice, as it will allow you to manage them better. But that's obviously up to preference. So you can use the super shotgun, you can use the plasma rifle, you can use whatever you want. But yeah, I feel like the weapons are definitely, for the most part, I think Duke Nukem and Quake had some weapons which were a little bit more like experimental, like Duke Nukem 3D had the freeze thrower, for example, which freezes enemies, or the shrinker, which makes them tiny and then you step on them. Yeah. And Quake had like the Thunderbolt weapon, which is similar to what the Shambler uses, which I think had limited range, maybe. But yeah, so for the most part, there are some weapons that are experimental, but the bulk of your arsenal is largely the same between all the games, I would say. And they're simple to use but effective. Simple to use, hard to master, but effective at actually dispatching the enemies, which is something that you probably don't see in some other games where they try to, like, they have stuff like cooldowns on some weapons. Like, they have weapons that overheat, for example.
Yeah.
Or they have stuff like extremely long reload times or whatever. So there's definitely none of that, thankfully. Like, most of the weapons don't even have reload as a concept. I think only Marathon, Marathon was the only game from this era which had reloading. And even that was pretty much, it didn't take that long to do.
Yeah, well, of course, it bears repeating that I absolutely condemn the reloading of the pistol in Duke Nukem 3D, but I'm pretty sure that's the only example that at least that comes to mind.
It's the only gun in the entirety of all the games we played that employs it.
And for good reason. Don't do that. Yeah. If the rest of your game doesn't do it, don't do it for that one. I think that, like, the thing is, when playing multiplayer Counter-Strike for so long, you grow to understand the value of reloading insofar as, like, if you have a lot of ammo for a gun and you want to be able to just suppress fire a position, having to reload makes it so that you have to manage the ammo that you have in your gun and the ammo that you have outside of your gun. When you have so many different guns in your arsenal, that's when I think it becomes unnecessary to worry about, because it's more likely that you'll run out of ammo for one gun and then have to switch to another gun, which in and of itself will have some sort of animation or delay, even if it's very minor, which will mean that you can't immediately start suppressing fire. And odds are the different weapons are going to be so distinct that while one gun, like the chain gun, may be really, really efficient at suppressing fire in a specific position to lock down an enemy and make it unsafe for them to move out, the other guns that you may have access to might not even be hit scan. Maybe they're projectiles, in which case it's even more of a delay before the threat returns. And, who knows what else you'll be doing. And it's a trade-off then if you're suppressing fire. You're less likely to be able to do that for a longer amount of time. You don't have to worry about implementing reloading or anything like that when you have so many different guns to choose from. And that's one of the things that I think makes it work in this particular context, whereas in other games it might be very disastrous. If you never had to reload, but you only had two weapons, well, odds are you're going to have a lot of ammo for those two weapons because those are your only two weapons. And if you have a lot of ammo and only two weapons and you never have to reload, then you can literally just hold down a spot forever if you know that there's an enemy there. And then, of course, that builds into level design of, how many spots like that are there on the map, stuff like that, where you can control it for other ways. But I think that's one of the reasons why it works in this context, whereas it feels like an alien mechanic now because so many games have instituted reloading. I think as long as reload speeds are generally fast and snappy,
it doesn't really worry. Reloading as a concept in itself. Again, in Marathon uses it, and I think it's fine there. But again, when you have more stuff like weapon overheating or really weird stuff that they basically implemented in some other games in order to make the weapon feel weaker than it is, because otherwise it would be way too powerful or whatever.
Crazy recoil patterns.
That's another one. So that is the kind of stuff I would avoid overall.
Yeah, another thing that's related to the weapons in general is like the random chance to deal damage or random damage in general, random chance to hit or miss. This is obviously more prevalent.
It's strongest in Wolfenstein.
Yeah, I was going to say it's more prevalent in the earlier stages of the game or the earlier games in this series that we played so far, but anything random is always going to not sit well with me because of the fact that it removes the ability for you as a player to take responsibility for the success or failure, take complete responsibility for success or failure. Any randomness in that sense is like, all right, well, that is a potentially legitimate excuse for failure. And I don't want that to ever be the case for anything that I do. I want to be able to say, all right, this is what I can do to not make that mistake again. And if I can't even identify it as a mistake because it might have been a random thing that the game decided for me, instead of me being able to say, oh yeah, that was where I fucked up, or that's where I did really well, and that's why I failed or succeeded, respectively. It removes the ability for me to have any agency in the game at all in that particular context, obviously. And so that's one of the things that I really would criticize about the game states in general, is that they employ any randomness whatsoever, be it for their AI, for the enemy weapons, for your weapons. It just doesn't seem like it fits in a game that is otherwise very visceral and very to the point and very much immersive based on its gameplay. And so that is one of the things that is a rightful criticism, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's definitely a completely understandable position. But like I said, Wolfenstein 3D was by far the game that employed this the most, in that not only it has random damage in itself, but it also has damage depending on distance, and also a chance to miss if you fire from a long distance. Whereas, for example, in Doom, you have the chain gun, which if you fire it the first time, it is basically a sniper rifle of sorts, and it always deals the same amount of damage, regardless of where you fire it from. So you can fire from the other side of the map, and it will always be 100% precise, at least on the first two bullets, because otherwise it would be insane. And it will always reliably deal the same amount of damage as it would if you were up close. So fortunately, that's an aspect that was dropped after Wolfenstein 3D. And as the games generally move towards more projectile-based gameplay, especially for the enemies, and we saw that like in Doom and even Nukem 3D had many projectile-based enemies, although it had more hit scan than Doom had. And then you had Quake, which I think it was mostly projectile as well. Although you also had a lot of weird stuff like the ogres, which threw grenades everywhere, which wasn't really projectile nor its scan. It was just pretty weird, I would say. But
I don't know what was up with that. I mean, it was like the pipe bombs, but if they were just thrown by a man with a giant chainsaw, so I don't know.
Yeah. And so we talked about the weapons, the enemies, the level design. What else do you think we should cover now?
Well, one thing that I did want to say is something related to the whole conversation about weapons, and one of the things that might be a nice addendum is, obviously I play a lot of Counter-Strike as well as been playing some of this stuff lately, and so one of the things that Counter-Strike employs to I would say its benefit, generally speaking, is that there is built-in inaccuracy to the weapon, but it's not random. It is based on a recoil pattern, or a spray pattern is what it's called colloquially. So you'll end up dealing with a specific amount of damage. It's same damage for each hit if it's the same part of the body. So if you attack somebody in the chest, it's different damage than if you hit them in the head. That is something I don't mind either, because it is based on precision. Now, when you're standing still, and you fire, your bullets rather follow a trajectory based on the weapon that you're firing, and so you draw a spray pattern when you're shooting and just staring at a wall or whatever. So your gun has a recoil, and you can control this by moving your mouse counter to the positions that your aim would be moving or your bullets would be moving. And so if you're drawing an L, if your bullets are drawing an L, then you, by drawing a backwards L, by going up instead of down, or pulling down instead of up, depending on where the gun goes, that will allow you to counteract it and keep your bullets accurate. And so that's based on, like, obviously rote memorization in this case, of doing it a lot of times, and muscle memory and stuff, but it's still a skill that you can practice and you can improve upon. You can improve your performance based on that. And I think that is a step in the right direction compared to having randomness, obviously. The game does unfortunately have random elements to it. Like if you're moving, I think there is some randomness to the way that your bullets go, instead of it always being like just so wildly inaccurate that you really wouldn't be able to learn it reliably. But at the very least, if you could, in theory, learn how that works instead of it being random, that would be better, because sometimes that does happen where you're running around like a lunatic shooting and you accidentally headshot somebody and there was no skill involved in that. So in the rare cases where it does work in somebody's favor, even though it shouldn't work in somebody's favor, that's one of those situations where you would rather it not happen at all. And so there really shouldn't be any randomness associated with that. And it also has randomness based on, like, there's a certain element of spray inaccuracy that is random when you're spraying from a very long distance, which I don't think should be the case. I think it should just, work similar to how it works up close. The difference being is that if it's, you have to make much more finer mouse movements if you're trying to hit a target that's farther away, because your bullets have to travel a lot longer. And so when you're correcting your spray pattern, you have to be much more precise with it when it's further away. So that's one of those situations where, like, it seems very obvious what the solution would be there, just removing the RNG associated with it, but it still involves skill-based expression and understanding of the game's core fundamentals and mechanics in order to take advantage of the guns and use them to their, the fullest of your ability and to the fullest of their ability as tools for you. And that's just something that I think I can get behind as a way to contrast it against how these games handled it, where, guns were either precise or randomly imprecise. And I think it's fine to do it that way. I just don't agree with the idea of including randomness either in Counter-Strike, like I gave in my example, or in the example of the randomness that you see either in Wolfenstein's random chance to miss, or anything else related to recoil or whatever. So I wanted to give that context, because I know you don't play Counter-Strike, so you don't really know about that.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, I agree overall. I mean, I think in Wolfenstein specifically, since the damage depends on distance, the game wants to reward you for getting as close as you can to the enemy. And if you could just stay away from the enemy, it would make the game probably very annoying, as enemies would become snipers from across the map, and you would just be able to take down everyone just from a safe distance with your chain gun. But I can definitely see why in Doom and later games the importance of random damage greatly was reduced, and not only in the fact that there's way less of it, but also the fact that the game doesn't need it nearly as much as Wolfenstein, or if at all, nearly as much as Wolfenstein does. So I think in that case, Wolfenstein is a bit of an outlier in the way, in the sense that the way the combat works in that game is completely separate from what was later found in the other games, essentially. It's still simple at its core.
Yeah.
Still arcade style, if you will.
Well, one of the other things related to weapons, actually, that we can talk about is the BFG. Obviously, this is only present in Doom 1 and 2, but I did want to make a special note of it, even if we don't take too long to talk about it, that it seemed very strange the way that it worked, where you had to be like, have enemies on screen, and then like you had to get as close as enemies as possible to deal as full damage because it was like spawning a projectile. I don't know if that's an engine limitation. Has that even been fixed in custom content or anything? Did anybody try to work to make it less clunky? Or is that clunkiness, has that clunkiness rather been embraced as just a skill that you have to learn in order to use the weapon?
Well, I would say that for the most part, people are so used to it that they can use it to its fullest potential, so they don't really think about changing it. But it's definitely been changed in some levels and modes that I've seen, where they just make it so that it deals a splash damage that damages enemies, but not you, for example, or it works in a different way. I think even some of the later Quake games had a BFG, actually. I don't remember if it was Quake 2, but I'm pretty sure Quake 3 had a BFG type gun, which behaves differently. So the concept was further improved not only in custom content, but also in the Quake series. So yeah, I would say that most mods don't do it simply because people are so used to it that they don't really think about it. But I can see why it's a very difficult weapon to get to grips with. Even though, for the most part, I would say that the plasma rifle is a preferable weapon to use in most situations. I just find it more versatile overall.
Well, it is for sure. I would just think like an obvious thing to change about that would be to make it a projectile that's slow moving, but fairly precise, or has some arc to it, or like something where you can learn the behavior of it and it makes it so that it rewards skill and positioning. But like maybe it gains damage as it gains momentum or distance or something, and then you can make it more about like
there's a mode
that
that does that. Actually, it's not for the BFG; it's for another weapon, but it does exactly what you described.
Yeah, I mean something to make it so that you don't have to go right up close and personal. Then you don't have to do some weird gimmick where it doesn't deal splash damage to you. You can make it so that it's similar to the rocket launcher. It does deal splash damage to you and it can destroy you, but you have to. So then it's rewarding for players who are able to line it up in their heads and do the mental math and get the trajectories sorted out and predict where their enemies are going and all that stuff. So I think that would be a better weapon in general. I just wanted to mention it because it was always something that was so fucking puzzling to me, the way that gun worked or didn't work.
Yeah, it's definitely very unusual even compared to the other classic FPS stuff, but no other game has a weapon that's quite like it. So yeah, we'll see if we'll deal with it again in future custom content. We will see. We may come back to it or come back to weapon discussion if we see different weapon concepts that are using custom content or stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things that I'm not 100% sure on right now, thinking about it. But I'm sure there's some examples, like you just talked about, Quake being one of them, that has some aspect of that. So,
yeah. Well, I think that about covers the basis. I don't know if you have any other thing you want to talk about for the retrospective.
No, honestly, not really. I'm thinking about it now, and I feel like we covered quite a bit of material in the hour and 20 minutes. Obviously, there's plenty of stuff we could talk more about, but nothing's coming to mind right now, so I think we can call it there.
Yeah. We can always do that in the next series. I guess I'll just make a quick note about the secret and the treasure element in Wolfenstein 3D specifically.
Oh, right. Yeah, we didn't talk about that.
Yeah, so the secrets in the games are generally completely optional in that you don't need to find any of them in order to complete the level. With I think there's like an exception in one of the Wolfenstein 3D levels where you need to find a secret, but it's very obvious, so you don't really miss it. But like they usually have supplies that you don't need to complete the game, but they make it easier. So they reward exploration. But in Wolfenstein specifically, you kind of have to find random walls that have secrets, whereas in some of the other games, they're a little bit more obvious about it. And in fact, I do remember plenty of times in your playthroughs, you would find a secret that you will be like, wait, this is a secret? This is actually almost in plain sight, so why is it a secret? So it definitely is way more obscure in Wolfenstein than it is in the later titles, but it's an aspect that fortunately isn't needed to progress. Otherwise, it would be very annoying. It would be basically like Super Mario Odyssey, where you basically need to play a hidden object game in order to win.
Yeah, but, no kidding.
It's just an aspect that some people enjoy, and the people that don't generally just don't bother, and they can play the maps fine regardless. So I just figured I would make this just a quick note about it, but I think that's pretty much it otherwise.
Yeah, I think we can call it there for now. That was our first part of the classic FPS retrospective. We've covered everything that we played so far. I'm sure some of it will crop back up again when we draw comparisons to whatever games we play next compared to the games that we played this round. But that was it. So thanks once again for joining me on this adventure, Dynamo. Appreciate you guiding me through and giving me all the source ports and everything else that I needed to actually get this stuff done.
You're welcome. I'm glad it worked out very well. It was actually way more stable than the Half-Life stuff, which you would think, given they have Steam and all, they have the ability to update the game the way they want. It's still in the hands of the same company, whereas this franchise is now part of completely different companies like Gearbox or Bethesda, whereas they still have a better the fans, thanks to the source code, were actually able to make stuff that's better than what you get on Steam, where the game doesn't fucking work. So,
yeah, pretty epic.
That's another thing to consider.
You get the Randy Pitchford edition if you use Steam, so you have to go about it getting it a different way. Meanwhile, this stuff is like, yeah, it's source ports. You're not paying for it, I guess, but you're still getting to the point where you're getting an experience out of the box that is more functional and more complete. And so, in that sense, shout out to the fans who've kept this shit alive, because it means that people like me who've never played it can come back and experience what it was like to actually play single-player content that, at the very least, made you feel like you weren't alone on a giant enemy map. So that was great. That was epic. So there you go.
Excellent. Well, guys, we'll see you on the next part whenever we get to do that. And I hope you found this insightful. I hope you had fun watching the videos. And yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
See ya.
See ya.